Okay, so in this video, I want to take a look at the equals method. So essentially a way to be able to compare two objects to see if the data that they hold, so the values of their fields, are equivalent to one another. So essentially what I want to be able to do in the context of this rectangle demo with a rectangle class, I want to be able to compare the length and width fields of two different objects to see if those are equal to each other. So essentially if two rectangles have the same dimensions. So one way I could do this is I could just go ahead and write out a little bit of code to implement the logic for something like this right here. Essentially the way this will work is I would say something like if, and then I want to go ahead and just do a comparison between the two objects. So say I want to compare rect and rect2, for example. So we'll say something like if rect.getLength, if this is equal to rect2.getLength, and also if their widths, so if rect.getWidth is equal to rect2.getWidth, then we can just go ahead and print out something like the objects are equal. Otherwise, if they're not, then we can go ahead and just say else. I'll print out the objects are not equal. Okay, so if we go ahead and run this and try it, in this particular case, because rect is using the narx constructor and rect2 is using the parameterized constructor with 10 and 5, these will have different dimensions, so we would expect them to not be equal to each other. So we'll go ahead and compile this and run it just to see what we're getting. We'll also go ahead and comment out these two lines so that the only thing we have to worry about is that print statement regarding the comparison. So we'll compile it, and then we'll run it, and in this case we see the objects are not equal. Okay. Well, let's say instead of trying this comparison with rect2, our rect and rect2, let's try rect and rect3 instead. In this case, we see that because we're using the narx constructor for both of these, we should get the objects are equal. So in this case, we're going to change this 2 to a 3. We'll save that, and we'll come over here, we'll compile it, and we'll run it, and now we see the objects are equal. So we can see right now our logic makes sense, but obviously if we do it this way, we'd have to constantly be changing the specifications in our Boolean expression to make comparisons on two different objects. So one way that we could fix this is we could just go ahead and take this code and just move it into its own separate method and then just call that method whenever we want to make a comparison between these two objects. But if I do that within the scope of my advanced rectangle demo class, I can only ever really use that method within this particular class because of the fact that the objects that I'm constructing and want to compare with it are going to be located inside of advanced rectangle demo. Where this becomes an issue is if I wanted to create multiple additional files that all want to use my rectangle class in some different way, and in some cases where some of these files might need to be able to make comparisons on them, I would want to make sure that I have something that's a bit more universal, so to speak. So what I want to do instead is create the logic for this equals method within the rectangle class itself. So what I can do is go ahead and just create that class right here, or that method right here. So I'm going to create a new method. I'm going to call it public boolean. This is going to be a boolean since I needed to return either a true or a false value based on whether or not the two objects that I'm comparing are equal to each other. And then I'm going to call it equals. Okay. Inside of the equals method, the thing that I'm going to pass into this method is going to be an object of the rectangle class. So I'm going to do rectangle, and I'm going to call this other rect, or just other rectangle essentially. Okay. The reason I'm going with this particular naming convention is because of the fact that whenever I use the equals method, I'm going to be calling the equals method on a particular object of the rectangle class, but I'm also going to be passing in another object of the rectangle class. So that's why I'm calling this thing that I pass in my other rectangle, since it's the other rectangle that I'm comparing. So in this case, we're now going to, let's just take this logic that we have right here. I'm going to go ahead and grab this and we're going to place that right here. So we're going to go ahead and insert that logic that I was just looking at. The one difference now is that instead of saying rect, that's going to correspond to the rectangle object that I'm currently looking at. So in that case, I can just use the this keyword right here. So we'll replace rect with this. So we're going to be getting the length and width of this rectangle. That also means that I don't need to use the get length. Instead, I can just use the length field directly. That's going to be true for both of these. And then the same thing applies right here. So instead of saying rect3, I'm going to say other rect. And instead of saying get length, I can just go ahead and say length directly. And same thing over here. So we'll go ahead and reduce it to this.length if that's equal to other rect.length, and if this.width is equal to other rect.width. And one thing that you might be noticing right now, if you are particularly aware of what's going on here, you might notice that I'm using the length field directly for this object other rect, even though technically that object is not the thing that I am directly accessing here. So you might be thinking to yourself that it should be get length because length and width are private, and so this other object that I'm accessing has its own private length and width. But the way that it actually works as far as private fields go is that it's only really dependent on where I've placed this declaration. So because this declaration is within the body of the rectangle class itself, I can actually just directly access these private fields of that other object, even if that's not necessarily the object that I'm inside of whenever I'm calling this method. Okay. The other thing we'll go ahead and do is we can go ahead and remove this logic right here. Instead, what I'm going to replace this with is a return statement. So we're just going to say right here, if this is all true, we can go ahead and return true. Otherwise, if this is not true, then outside of that if statement, we'll go ahead and just return false. And of course, the way that this is going to work is if I hit this return statement here, this is going to end the method right here. So just return true. We'll never see line 66. But if this is false, then we don't see line 64, but we do see line 66. So it's basically going to pick one or the other, and that's going to be the return statement that allows us to break out of this equals method. So we'll go ahead and save it like that. And then coming over here, we can go ahead and reintroduce those two print statements. And the way that I'm going to do it instead now is I'm going to say if rect. So I'm going to go ahead and pick a particular object that I want to call the method on. So if rect is the object that I'm calling this method on, that is the object that this will be referring to. And then if I put in something like, say, rect2, then rect2, that's going to be the thing that other rect is referring to. Okay. So if these two things are equal, we'll go ahead and have our print statement. And right here we'll say something like the two rectangles are equal, else we'll say the two rectangles are not equal. Okay, so we'll go ahead and save that. We'll come over here, we'll compile this, we'll run it. So the first one, we see the two rectangles are not equal, so we still get the same statement as we got before when we did the objects are not equal. If we instead do this against rect3, we'll compile this and run it, and now we see the two rectangles are equal. Okay, so a couple of things that we've improved upon. Whenever we want to actually use this in our other classes, so in, say, the main method or just any other method, the code necessary to access that logic has become a lot more concise. We just have to call the equals method and just pass in another object. The other thing that's really useful about this is the fact that now we can actually use this equals method inside of any other classes, because they can all just access that equals method from the rectangle class. Okay. So this is going to wrap up everything for the equals method. In the next video, we're going to be looking at one last method that I want to use inside of my rectangle class, and that's going to be a method for being able to copy objects of the rectangle class.